architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. And always we are trying to advance the frontier of what it might be to think about architecture, looking at it in particular from other disciplinary perspectives. Today we have something special. Today I have recorded a conversation with my good friend Warren Etheredge, who is a filmmaker, a film school teacher, a social activist, and a public speaker and conversationalist who has a fascinating take on filmmaking, architecture, and life in general. And we had this conversation actually in the faculty club of the University of Washington. And so there's a lot of background ambient noise, but I hope you will enjoy the conversation nevertheless, because it is quite fascinating. Just to keep the flow of the conversation going, this time actually there is not going to be a break in the middle, and we will simply cut into the conversation with people talking in the background when we are just beginning to talk about architecture and ruins and how buildings get destroyed and how that compares to filmmaking. Here we go. I hope you enjoy. So your dad was a publisher?
He was an artist, artist designer. He worked in advertising. He worked for himself, and then he also designed book jackets and things like that. So in publishing, he was, I guess that was his easy, steady money.
Right.
That's fascinating reading about your father and his art in his later years.
I don't know, he had a mix. On the one hand, he cultivated this aura of, but like all artists, he was very insecure about it too.
Right.
His relationship with me was fundamentally altered when he painted a mural in our house. But then we sold the house and painted over the mural before selling it.
He would like you to remove the wall and like a Banksy or something. I loved reading the book, and I was fascinated by his wavering sense of ego. Other times at which he seems exceptionally prideful. And then others when he seems as if he wishes to be servant of the public.
Right.
Lost in his work.
Right.
Do something that will help others, but not draw attention to himself, while somehow drawing attention to him.
So all this is, of course, my reading of the man, right? This is how I see him. That's fascinating how you are characterizing that. Yeah, I probably see him as a prideful man, no?
It's interesting because at times I feel impressed, so the pridefulness is not a concern. At other times I'm sort of charmed by the pridefulness. And then later on it's more like, let's calm down.
Right.
I don't know why the story of working with that theater company and that show later in life and his refusing the idea of him being retired. And I feel like I know of successful people like that, this weird thing of I'm comfortable with what I've accomplished, I'm proud of myself, I can relax now. But if you say one wrong, cross, contradictory thing, they're on top of you.
Yeah.
That's what I get. I don't know if that's right.
Well, there may be a different interpretation of retire in America versus India. Here it is that you've reached a certain stage,
Right.
You've made enough money, you have enough, you feel you can relax now, right? In India, at 58, you have to leave the job, and that's called retirement. So it comes across as it's like an impending death sentence But that's how they're portrayed.
Is that why you moved here?
For sure. The idea of retiring at 58, which basically meant losing your job, but on the other hand, getting a pension for the rest of your life.
What I'm curious about is that feels like such a conflicted experience to start with, having put so much into it. And then my understanding is that many of those structures are now gone. And this is one of the things where I think about architecture and film, or architecture versus film. You know, I usually think of architecture as outlasting us. And when it doesn't, what does that feel like? I mean, I assume if you've invested something in designing any sort of edifice, that you have some ego, some pride, something goes along with that, and you can always point to it, and then if it goes...
It's a huge thing for architects to see their buildings destroyed. And buildings belong to somebody else always, all along, right?
But I would assume that you suspect that you don't have to worry about ownership, because they'll just be there. But then, isn't recently you read something, I think in Manhattan it's going to be the tallest building ever sort of consciously demolished soon. Purchase a skyscraper and they're tearing the whole thing down to replace it with another building. That's one of those weird things. I've never thought of a tall building in New York as coming down at any point.
That's fascinating. So, now the tallest buildings are in Asia, but the tallest building to be destroyed is now in New York.
It's the decline of civilization.
I mean, they say, Walter Benjamin talked about this, that all architecture tends to ruin. It's an important thing to remember. From the moment you put a building up, it is decaying. And ultimately, all architecture will ruin. That's why we go to see ruins around the world, right?
But it's interesting in that when you go to ruins, you think, those are separate from me, those are the past. You don't consider the world, your environment, as decaying necessarily. With the notable exception of 9/11, most of us don't see the full lifespan of a building.
Right. Well, 9/11 was a spectacular display of the fragility of architecture and the fragility of life. And I think that's why it was so powerful. Right. Because people do not expect buildings to collapse.
Right.
People getting anonymously killed in Afghanistan doesn't have an impact. But when the Twin Towers come down...
And I think maybe we spoke about this before, but I was always amazed growing up with those buildings is that I don't know many New Yorkers who actually liked them.
Right.
Considered them eyesores, and then we're all devastated when they come down. I think, oh my God, I miss them so much. As much as I didn't care for them aesthetically beforehand, they feel very much a part of my being and my youth, and they had to be there.
Right.
I still can't look at the skyline without a sense of loss, and I don't mean that in the tragic loss of life, I just mean like it doesn't look right to me.
And that one big tower they have made?
I do think the Freedom Tower provides a great parallel for filmmaking.
How so?
The whole process of trying to replace the Freedom Tower is how so much happens in Hollywood. Somebody identifies a gaping hole, an opportunity, and somebody comes up with an idea. Oh, we must fill that hole. Let's get some people together to talk about this, and let's find a vision for it.
Yeah.
And since Daniel Libeskind, comes up with a master plan and an idea of what the buildings could look like, and yes, and people get excited, and a studio and producers get excited, and then they bring in other people for their input, people potentially with more money and more power and fewer ideas, who certainly should contribute to the original creative vision of it, and thus. What was the Freedom Tower was a 12-year process or so, and then in that 12-year process, which in the film world would be called development hell, the scripts are reworked, the ideas are reworked, so that by the end, what remains is maybe the same title, maybe a couple of the incidental characters, maybe simply the height of the building, and in the end. everyone hoots and hollers and celebrates. We did it. We've made this thing. But nobody actually saw the process through from beginning to end to maintain that vision, fulfill that vision,
Right.
deliver upon the original expectations. And so you wind up with something that is a product, but a shell of what that was supposed to be. And then with my understanding of Freedom Tower, you have the site developer, Governor Pataki, you've got the Port Authority, you've got all those people all contributing, just like studio execs and marketing people. In the end,
It's a mediocre project. Yeah, a lot of Hollywood is very mediocre.
yeah, and it's mediocre by the very nature of, in my mind, by the very nature of the process. And just like the Freedom Tower, I think, was bound to fail the second they invited that much collaboration.
Right.
I know multiple screenwriters who worked on the movie Now You See Me. Not a single one wants to take credit for it. And they're all very good writers in and of themselves. But it's impossible to craft something truly artistic, or at least truly your own, if you're fending off the notes and visions and needs of 100 others.
Indeed. And like architecture, a lot of film is just formulaic, commercial, right? I mean, there isn't even a whole. It's like, oh, we need a this summer's rom-com and this summer's superhero.
Right. And some people are better at that than others. It serves its purpose, but is at best forgettable. Frankly, Seattle is a city, for the most part in my mind, filled with forgettable architecture. It's the summer slate of Paramount.
I love it. Seattle architecture is the summer slate of Paramount. And they're both really expensive things.
That's the trap, right? If you want to do something truly grand, if you have a large vision for something, you have to get buy-in of lots of people. You can't do it single-handedly. And with rare exceptions, once you start doing that, you are going to start compromising. And rarely does that compromising work well. But those systems feel built to fail. And I'm sure there are exceptions in architecture, but it seems once you're doing something on a large scale, the architect must be beholden to others.
Oh, for sure.
At the same time, on the large projects where architects are given no constraints, I'm not sure that's the answer either.
No.
I don't know if Paul Allen wrote a blank check to Frank Gehry, but if I could have avoided it, I would have.
But there it shifts over to the art model.
Right.
These are not works of architecture.
Oh, in Paul Allen's mind, it's an artwork, right?
It's an artwork. He's trained precisely for whimsy. That is what he wanted. So filmmaking is very much like a big money business. Like architecture, it's a commercial business. It has this huge service industry. Like architecture, you just kind of produce the schlock for general consumption.
Right.
But then there is the auteur class, like in architecture. How does the Stanley Kubrick come into being? Those are expensive films.
They are. I mean, there's a small group of filmmakers who get to, and I'm sure it's the same with architects, that they have somehow created an aura of artistry around themselves that others want to finance and become classy by association. I helped produce a Stanley Kubrick film.
You did?
No. I wish I could say that. Yes. But if one can say that, it suddenly makes the producer or the production company, the studio, it elevates them.
But that's later on. Once you are an established author.
You can do it relatively quickly, though. I mean,
so why doesn't everybody do it?
Why doesn't every filmmaker do that? because very few filmmakers have anything that could be even misperceived as a vision. I'm not personally a fan of Quentin Tarantino's work, but you can watch those early films. You can watch Reservoir Dogs and go, oh, there's something happening here. Whether you like it or not is almost incidental to the idea of like, oh, that represents something that feels fresh today. And to me will feel painfully tired 10 years later. But that's that's another story. Right. But once you do that, if you can do that, people celebrate that. In part because creativity and innovation and cinematic storytelling is fairly rare. The process, much like commercial architecture, is formulaic. It is there not to serve an audience, but to serve an industry. And only, I guess, nominally serve the audience, right? Just like I think a lot of buildings nominally serve the people that live or work within them. But they're really there for others to make money.
It's all about ROI.
Right. And so most of the times that the idea of people who are not artists, but rather skilled laborers, can do better. When I have written for television, the most important trait was certainly not the quality of my writing.
Is that right?
It was the ability to deliver the writing
on time,
or in accordance with the specs they had handed me. And anyone who can do that and is willing to do that on a regular basis will probably work for the rest of their lives. It doesn't mean they'll become famous. It doesn't mean they'll become millionaires, but it means that they will work. Right. And Hollywood is filled with people who are lunch pail craftspeople who have elevated themselves to the title of artists for absolutely no reason. For those in the business, they like to think of it as an art form.
Yeah, sure. Right. No, we don't consider it an art form.
No.
We need the entertainment.
And I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but similar to architecture, a lot of entertainment, whether it's film or TV, is delivered to the public with the idea that we're delivering what the public wants, what the audience wants. However, I'm not sure that's what's happening. I think that film and TV have just so consistently force-fed the same crap to people that that's what they assume it looks like. However, if those rare moments when you can actually show them something different, deliver something different, give them a different type of movie, give them a type of film, you then have to couch it in a way so that they're not scared of it, that then you see what the public actually wants. But for the most part, both the suppliers and those who are, quote-unquote, demanding it are willing to settle for whatever's most familiar.
Why is the idea of what the public really wants, this sort of democratic idea, important for you in this equation? Why can't an author just be a misunderstood genius?
Well, they can be. They may be an unfinanced, misunderstood genius as well. And it's not important to me. One of the things I'll rant about when I'm trying to teach screenwriting or storytelling is that, and this comes from the film industry initially, this idea of writing universally, writing for the four quadrants, which essentially means every man, woman, and child on this planet. But you can't create something that is universal by trying to be universal in my mind. My argument has been for a long time that when you try to do that, you will fail without a doubt. And that the only way you can achieve something of meaning and connectivity is by writing emotionally and honestly and vulnerably. And so the more specific we are to our emotional experience of the world as individual artists, storytellers, creators, the more universal it can become. Doesn't mean it's everybody. But if I share my story, if I share my art in such a way that it has deep meaning to me, I trust that it will probably have resonance for others.
I'm with you on that.
We're not going to fight over that one? So, I mean, I have to assume, once again, that there's an architectural parallel for that. You know where I see it, actually? This is an interesting one, and there are exceptions to it. Football stadiums. Every year or two, there's a new football stadium built. and they get bigger. They're more luxury boxes. But for the most part, maybe with the exception of the one in Atlanta, I haven't seen that yet, they all look like the same thing. Like, I know they're essentially serving the same functionality, but there's not a lot of difference. So when Jerry Jones, who owns the Dallas Cowboys, built the new Cowboy Stadium in Arlington, and everybody hoots and hollers, and then when it's done, it's not that it's bad, it's just that
It's not good
it's not,
in any way.
there's nothing novel there, there's nothing fresh. It feels like, oh, you just have a glitzier version of what everybody's been doing for the past 50 years.
It's optimized to maximize access to concessions, TV screens, view angles, and malls. It's like airports, same thing. The whole thing is not set up to convey the latest reading of the excitement of flight as it was in the old days. You know, think of the TWA terminal or the Dulles in DC, or various airports.
Even LAX originally initially had some charm,
It had.
and now it's just a
Nothing.
horror.
Now it's all designed to shake as many dollars as you can off you in the mall.
Whether it's stadiums or airports, it's amazing to me because
They're like
They-
Marvel movies like now. It's like,
they are. Utilitarian is not a bad thing, but those things only have the barest form of functionality. They are just profit-generating machines.
Yeah.
I travel a fair amount, and I don't think I've yet been in an airport where I felt comfortable.
all the airports now look familiar and the same.
Right, thank goodness.
Okay, now that we've got that out of the way,
Okay,
I want
yes.
to return to Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley, yeah.
The 50th anniversary, 2001.
2001, right.
I mean, my God, it's still such an incredible film.
I will validate you, yes. Incredible
Thank you. Thank you. I thought I was a minority, but I don't think I am.
It's an incredible film, and I would say that, by today's standards, it was relatively inexpensive, but he was allowed to go do what he wanted to do. Burger King was not commenting on the film.
Tarkovsky, who allowed him to make all those films?
Amazingly, the Russians.
I mean, how did he get away with it?
The Tarkovsky thing is interesting. The Kubrick thing is, once again, I think that he developed his...
Auteur style?
Yeah, he developed his style
Did
and
these
his
movies
reputation.
make money?
I think 2001 did fine, yeah. But by whose standards did it do fine? I mean, that's the interesting thing is...
Did it not run a loss? Let's start there.
I'm sure it profited. I mean, but that's the funny thing about how the industry works, is that it's now built on these big bet movies that have to gross a tremendous amount of money to cover not just production costs, but the marketing costs, and ideally so much money that it pays for the stuff that did not go well. But, where I see it is less in Hollywood, like we can demean Hollywood and the studios all we like, but I just think of them as corporate entities. That's a different thing. But even in smaller production companies, even in smaller distributors, they always start with this wonderful vision. We're going to take these smaller films, we're going to do something special with them, we're only going to champion a small set of them, and we're going to stay lean, and we're not going to need to make so much money. And then invariably one of their films makes a fair amount of money, and then they grow the organization, and then they take on more films than they can handle, and thus they start to lose money on some of them because they're no longer paying attention to the ones that they really care about, and they fall in the same trap.
I understand that.
But you just won 2001.
I still want the auteurs.
Some of them exist. Paul Thomas Anderson,
Okay.
who did There Will Be Blood and The Master, and most recently Phantom Thread, which was Oscar nominated for Best Picture. I mean, he's somebody who gets to make movies the way he wants to. I'd like to stop him personally, but but I can't deny that the positive of watching one of his films is that they are clearly the vision of one individual with nobody getting in the way.
Is that the key thing? Is authorship singular?
It's not that it's singular, because all film is collaborative, but it has to be a singular voice, vision guiding the process, and that person should not be an executive. That person should not have an office.
Without question.
Right? That person should be out there doing
The
the
whole
work.
business of collaborative design. It's just camel making.
It's like Seattle and consensus. I don't want consensus. I want leadership. I want some thought. But a good filmmaker is collaborative in the sense that she or he is actually taking ideas from others to help fulfill his vision for the piece to make it the best it can be, but still guiding the whole process. But when money in Hollywood and marketing people get involved, it's less about somebody guiding this vision to completion, and it's more about a really good project manager.
You know, the interesting thing about fashion, which is kind of, I think, a parallel industry,
Right.
because it both has a mass consumer aspect to it, which is the bulk of it, 98%. And then it has this auteurship, haute couture, big shows, right? But the interesting thing there is, it's the same people. I mean, Alexander McQueen would do 2 high design shows and then would design market lines rest of the year.
Right, and I think it's where Hollywood falls too, is that we have Oscar season. I don't know why good films are ghettoized to the fall, but they are, right? Keep in mind, from September to December, we actually give you pretty decent films. From January through August, you're on your own, people. Those are the commercial lines, right? And that's where the bulk of the money and the time and the effort goes.
Right.
But we'll show off a couple of these films.
Right.
Each studio has 1, 2, 3 films that they feel very proud of. That's their haute couture. The fall is New York Fashion Week.
Yeah. In film.
In film.
In architecture, we don't have Fashion Week. We need
Right.
Fashion Week in
We do,
architecture.
really. I don't know how that would go, but it's going to be one big runway.
I mean, we have the awards.
Right. But there is a sense of like the press around any major building that goes up.
Nothing like the Oscars.
But architects have enough ego to sustain themselves.
Architects have an ego that certainly can match that of any author, film director.
Oh.
Easily.
There's a reason why architects have such good fashion sense and glasses. It's not because they're trying to blend in with the crowd.
No.
I mean, that's an intriguing thing for me with architects. The architects I know seem to have/need their own ego-generating machine.
The fancy architects, yes, for
Yeah.
sure. Because in a sense, like filmmaking, to put through a building, $500 million building, with your personal vision, with all the trades and constituencies that are involved,
Right.
if you aren't sledgehammering your way through, it's not going to happen. if you don't drive a vision.
And so part of the individual image drives that vision.
Yes.
But I think that is sort of like the auteur thing.
It is.
They just do it with looking worse. Academically, it's antithetical to architecture in that you have a lot of undereducated people in that industry. No, but the architects are deeply rooted in academics.
Yes. We would like to think so.
Like, it always amuses me when a student comes to me and, asks about, like, is it necessary for them to get a degree? Nobody cares.
In the film world?
In the film world, nobody cares.
Really?
It's totally insignificant. A lot of people who didn't go to college, lots of high school dropouts.
And that's a badge of honor?
No, and frankly, people shouldn't.
I like film school, and they're the ones who celebrate Coppola and Tarkovsky's and the Bergman.
It depends on the film school. I think there are a lot of high-end, top-notch film schools that, would be in anybody's top 10 list of film schools that are not about celebrating or studying the history of film and the film arts, and are more about celebrating the commercial successes of today, draped in artistry. Okay,
Tell
go
me,
ahead.
you are a pedagogue, you teach film school.
Yes.
You have started a film school.
Yes.
You run a film school.
Yes.
So what's your film teaching philosophy?
I'm all about story. USC, considered one of the best film schools in the country, really doesn't teach screenwriting. It's a fascinating choice for a film school. So I believe that anything, it doesn't have to be film, it doesn't have to be television, anything starts with a story. If you don't understand why you're telling your story, there's no point to it. About 16 years ago, when Tom Skerritt and myself and 3 other filmmakers co-founded the film school, the idea was to have a film school without cameras, to just have a film school in which it was all about story, story, story. So the idea was to get students thinking about story and story alone, because the second you introduce a camera in a film school, nobody wants to talk about story, they want to get their hands on the camera. That's sort of a natural thing.
But how can you separate that in a film school? Why aren't those the same thing? Story and the camera.
They are, but it's like introducing crack to a kindergartner.
I see. Let's stay with that a minute.
Okay.
You compared the camera to an addictive drug. Once you have had it, there is no way out. That testifies to the power of the camera, which I would agree with you about.
It definitely does. Once people can make something, that's what they want to do. But I think it must be true of architecture that you can't just go build it. You can't just go draw it. You have to immerse yourself for some time in actually considering all the, not just the ramifications of what you might construct, but the environment. There has to be time spent in just mindful genesis of an idea.
That's what I would like to think as an academic.
Right.
But as a person who was recently trashing academic thinking, I thought you would go the other way and you would say, just give the camera, put that in the hands, and they will make films. It's sort of a classic philosophy.
No. That's like 10,000 monkeys with 10,000 typewriters.
Right?
Yeah, eventually somebody will make a good film, but it's not proven itself. When people talk about the digital revolution, I understand, like, yes, that's great, more people can make films, but as somebody who's worked as a curator and programmer for years, just because more people can make films has not increased the percentage of good films out there. It just means that there's more crap to sift through. There has to be some appreciation for what came before in my mind. There has to be some understanding of the building blocks of the field you're working within. And there also has to be a passionate reason for approaching the material you are at any time. To me, it's as important to know when not to make a film as it is to make the film.
You're sounding like a thoroughbred academic. I don't understand. What's wrong with you? No, I couldn't agree with you more, but I thought we were going to fight about this.
What alarms me is this phrase that comes up all the time, write what you know, is comforting to people because people think, oh, I know things, I can do that.
Right.
I have a camera, I know something, I can do it.
Right.
And to me, the basis of storytelling is not write what you know, it's write what you're desperate to understand.
Yes.
If you don't have a compelling need to find the story, to tell it because it's an imperative for you to get to the end, to discover something, then I don't know that anyone else will get much value out of it. If you're doing it for the money, if you're doing it because that's what you've been asked to do, if you're doing it because you want to prove a point, I think those are all awful reasons to make art or buildings.
Right. So what is that phrase you told me last time about storytelling? There has to be a struggle or something.
Yeah, this idea of writing what you're desperate to understand boils down to something that I refer to as the nugget. And it's a question that generally comes in a format of a yes or no question, but it's a question that may be answered by anybody other than the main character and the storyteller. So the storyteller, in my mind, has to share the same question, the same doubt, the same struggle that the character does. Those questions, to me, boil down to first-person pronoun questions. Am I good? Am I brave? Am I significant? Am I worthy? Am I loved? Am I loving? Am I lovable? Am I honest? Am I merciful? Am I right? Am I sane? Am I special? Am I trusting? Am I trustworthy? Am I loyal? Am I just? They go on. There are 60, 70 that I identify as coming up a lot.
And those are all the stories that there are in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that funny thing of people say, well, there are only 7 stories in the world, there are only 20. I don't know how people come up with these numbers.
But you believe that there is this finite set.
I believe, particularly for creators and cultures of a certain level of affluence, or at least security, yes, there is this finite number of stories.
Why do you qualify that?
If I were struggling to find clean water or enough food to eat, or worried about dying on a daily basis, I don't know that my storytelling would indulge itself in, am I special? Like, I don't know that that's the...
I will have to disagree with you on that.
And maybe you will change my approach to storytelling.
Yes, I mean, the sort of narcissistic edge to existential questioning may be a problem of privilege. But the engagement with the meaning and purpose of life and being alive is universal. I believe that every kid born in the slum feels he or she is destined for something and narrates his or her life story as the question of what happened. Which is why, you go to India during festival season and there are these big festivals which tell the story of the Ramayana and, the hero's journey and the epics and so on. They are packed. Bollywood movies in the slums. Right. There are TVs in every shack. There may not be running water, but there's a bloody TV to watch the movies. Nobody's giving up on Amitabh Bachchan. Architecture be damned. Bollywood produces, 3 times the number of films Hollywood does. And that's not based on the speculations of the rich and idle.
Right.
That's based precisely on the speculations and desires of the vast masses.
I would have a question for you, and this is a Hollywood and Bollywood question. I'll make it binary, even though it's not really binary. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of storytelling that exists, a lot of movie making that exists, that is purely wish fulfillment, which I think is narcotizing for audiences.
It is.
And then there's storytelling, the storytelling that I'm personally more interested in, which is not about wish fulfillment, but about spiritual provocation, for lack of a better phrase.
There are 17 narratives in the world.
Right.
One would argue that the great epics of the West and the East, Indian and Christian, must be one of those.
The great ones, yes.
Yeah.
But we've moved far from the epics. The evolution from the epic tale to the tentpole film, like the big Hollywood film, like this year it'd be the Avengers, Infinity War, something like that. That film around which everything else can profit, right? Or something that launches a series of films. Those are not epic. Here's where I think we can find common ground.
Okay.
One of the things that intrigues me is that in the not-too-distant past, when shows like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad and others became popular and critics started writing about it as the new golden age of television and, oh my goodness, the anti-hero. And I think the anti-hero is the basis of the epic storytelling you're talking about. If we think about arguably the most successful writer in the English language, Shakespeare, like he did awfully well with all those characters being anti-heroes. It's their flaws that make them relatable. Television has started to get it, but film has left that behind. And that's where I think that divide comes between the wish-fulfilling movie and the story that has lasting impact. So here's another way to look at it. The filmmaker Shekhar Kapur said that Western filmmaking is obsessed with resolution, and Eastern filmmaking is interested in harmony. And that's something that I try to incorporate when I'm teaching screenwriting and storytelling, is that the idea is not to complete a story to deliver a message or a moral or to give the final answer for something, but rather to explore something so that in the end we can all make our peace with this facet of our lives. I always think of Edwin Schlossberg. He said that the skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. And I love that quote because it's not about telling other people what to think. Stories shouldn't tell people what to think. It should create this world in which they can.
Give me an example of a great thinking film.
Let's go in the not-too-distant past. I think the movie Moonlight, which won its Oscar, I think did a wonderful job of creating a world with little judgment or commentary. It's certainly not the feel-good movie of the year. However, it does engage you to think about the world in which this character grows up and the challenges he faces for his race, for his sexual orientation, for the influence of those around him. It doesn't tell you this is what you should do. It just says, here you go.
So it's sort of more documentary.
No, it doesn't have to be. I don't think. I think actually you can do a lot more without it being documentary, with a little fictionalizing life.
Documentary in character is what you just described to me.
That's fair to say. You lay out the character. I still think that there is a structure to the story.
Of course.
I still think that you are hitting upon 3-act structure, which I see a little differently than many, but there's still a structure to the piece that you still have to leave the audience somewhere where they actually have something to consider. You have to walk them through enough options so that there's something to really stew in. But I don't want an answer. And that's why he won.
That's right. That's right. But, even epic tales are in that sense moral fables, in Indian context, or the hero's journey in the Western classic concept do have a message. Those are ancient narratives. To return to 2001.
We're going to make sure we all love Kubrick by the end of this. Go ahead.
That's the most puzzling ending ever.
I was just about to say, I was hoping you were going to explain it all to all of us who are listening. But arguably, the brilliance of that movie, in my mind, and why it holds up is because it does exactly the thing that we're talking about. It is create that context in which you can think. There's no easy answer to the end of 2001. You are left thinking. How many movies do we see now where you are left with, wow, I loved what I just saw, and I don't know what I just saw.
Yeah. That's this gold star.
That is. I think there are very few filmmakers who are willing to do that. I think there are too few filmmakers who are curious enough to do that, or confident enough to do that, and certainly very few studios and financiers who want any part of that. It's a tough sell. As a generalization, Americans don't really care for ambiguity.
People in general don't. I mean, they want a sense of satisfaction and closure and the belief that it's all going to be all right.
Right.
Because their own lives are so ambiguous and uncertain.
But I think art's responsibility, and even architecture's responsibility, is to be provocative on some level, not necessarily to the point of annoyance, but to the point where it reminds you that you are alive in this moment.
So you would be happy with architecture that forces you to think rather than solves problems and makes it comfortable for you to sit and enjoy the atmosphere?
Well, I know that architecture rarely accomplishes the goal that you just set out there in terms of making it comfortable. Going back to the airports, I've not once been comfortable in an airport. I would like a building that sparks some thought as well as comfort. Like, to me, comfort is not the end goal.
Give me an example. Does the Seattle Public Library spark thought?
I think that building did initially, externally, and then internally it just sort of frustrates me.
Okay. What's your example?
It'll sound sort of trite, but I am not a religious person. But I can go into different religious structures and question my thoughts about my spirituality and my belief systems. The good ones do that.
So you're thinking of the Notre Dame in Paris, or?
There's a church in North Manhattan.
Okay, I get it. It's a Gothic kind of massive nave, high ceiling.
But they're still building it. Like,
building it?
They're still working on it. So after all these decades, it's essentially done. Mm-hmm. But they're still working on it, and there's something that the day where they bless the animals, they actually parade large animals. It's a place where, for moments, I get the sense of something grander than myself. I'm not necessarily speaking of a god, but there's something else going on here.
So that's a sublime character.
Yes.
I think of Richard Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Yes.
And the opening of 2001. Just so that we don't stray too far.
We don't want to get away from that, okay? As long as I can talk about the sequel 2010 at some point, we'll be fine. So it's a beautiful piece of music, a beautiful opening, yes.
But those are sort of sublime qualities. But that's not what you were talking about earlier as things that make you question.
There are many things that make me question the architect, but that's not what I mean either. There's one familiar to both of us here on campus, Gould Hall, which I find an amazing building because my opinion of it shifts constantly. Concrete exterior is off-putting to me, and I think, oh, what have they wrought? And then I get inside, and that same material becomes beautiful to me. And the cavernous atrium and the way the stairs are placed in there makes me reconsider my superficial critiques of things, go deeper within them. There are certain days you can go in there and the light is coming in such a way that is almost church-like to me.
Right,
but
sure.
from the outside, I'm sort of horrified.
So it's a setup.
Yeah.
Because it horrifies you on the outside, then you come in, it's sublime.
Right. It's a building that I have multiple thoughts about on a regular basis. Partly because I'm exposed to it. But there are not a ton of buildings that do that, but I like that. I like having my beliefs challenged.
You think that's the purpose of auteurship?
I hope so.
Great storytelling is to make your beliefs challenged?
Yes, for the storyteller and for those who get to hear them, watch them, certainly. My approach is this, that our beliefs, which we cling to, are nothing more than bumper stickers until they've been tested. Your beliefs have to be tested for them to have actual meaning. And I would like to live a life in which I have moved beyond a simple conceit constructed from years of education and experience, but rather ones that, having developed all that, are then suddenly pulled down, and I'm forced to really think, is that what I want? Is that what I need? Is that what I believe?
So you don't want a film which, or an architecture which gives you the answer?
No.
Not in a superficial way, but what about a Dalai Lama Buddhist version of things? I mean, there are, in the end, perhaps only 7 truths to life also.
Right.
Because there are only 7 stories.
You can order those truths now for $14.95. I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to be asleep. I find
Why not?
Why not? Because whether or not there is a life after this one, on the off chance that this is the only one, I'd like to be conscious for it. I'd like to fully engage it. Yeah. And I find a ton of people, a ton of audiences, and worse, a ton of filmmakers, storytellers, artists, craftspeople, really are sort of asleep.
Yeah, I agree with that. But so you wouldn't get along well with the Dalai Lama then?
No. I'd go with a Buddhist notion that life is suffering, and that would be culturally true for my Jewish heritage as well. You know, in Viktor Frankl, I think that there's a certain amount of acceptance that life is suffering, but in that suffering there's something to be gained. I don't want to tune out the suffering. I don't want to escape it. I don't want to be intoxicated for it, other than this Prosecco. I want to be aware of it. I mean, it comes from personal experience, too, that I've had many traumatic experiences in my life, and I would not want to relive a single one of them. However, I'm grateful to each of them because they stirred some part of me to be more awake, alive, vigilant, or potentially hyper-vigilant on the negative end of that scale than I would have been otherwise.
So you're a supporter of PTSD?
I work regularly with people with PTS, and I make the distinction of PTS rather than PTSD. Is like the D is for disorder. Mm-hmm. It's not a disorder. If you are witness to, party to, victim of horrific or traumatic circumstances, it is only normal, if you are still conscious, alive, and human, to have that scar you in some fashion.
Right.
So the acceptance of it not as a disorder, but actually a normal function of human response is critical. But I feel there are a lot of, whether it's a lot of therapies or a lot of art, that would rather have you believe that there is peace, closure, some complete forgiveness that we are capable of, which I think is a little bit of a sham. And going back, I think a lot of our storytelling encourages, nurtures, and propagandizes that sort of faith in a peace that does not exist.
Instead, what should stories be doing?
With PTS, I think we should be telling the stories, and
You're offering PTS as a template for storytelling.
yes, I would, actually. I think that story, Joseph Campbell is not listening because he's dead, so I feel safe in saying I'm not a big fan of the hero's journey, the way it's structured, but
okay.
I'll talk about the three-act structure in a very simple, unorthodox fashion. I see the first act of storytelling as delusion. I think that most humans live in a delusional state, in such a manner that they're able to live their lives, get through day by day, and lots of people can go to their deathbeds in their delusional state. My mom will go to her deathbed. She's 89 now. She shows no signs of breaking that. And when people break out of that delusion...
Delusion is religion.
Could be religion. It could just be the belief system you've created for yourself. I'm okay, or this is enough, or enough satisfaction. I mean, it can even be around negative things.
You're saying unrecognition of the necessary uncertainty of life.
Correct.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like we're constantly, or many are constantly moving to this place of, let's create that state where I don't have to think. That's why they don't want to be confronted by stories that actually ask questions.
Right.
Now, Plutarch said that character is simply habit long continued. That's what I think that delusional state is, the habit long continued. Story begins with the breaking of the habit by forced choice or necessity, in my mind. Every once in a while, people, particularly characters in stories, are pushed out of their delusional state, whether they like it or not. And when they are forced to change as a result, they will try to create the second act, which is fantasy. They'll try to make this new world better than the first world. Oh, that delusion aside, now I know what it's about. Right. Everything's going to be fine now. Yes. But like all fantasy comes crashing down. Yes. And leaves the person in a worse place than they were before, because now not only are they in a bad place, but they can't return to the delusional place they once existed.
Correct.
And the third act is the reality. Right. Which is now that you know that you were living in a delusion, your new approach doesn't work, you're going to have to come up with a way of making your place in this world that works for you. Yeah. And in my mind, that kind of story is always traumatizing for the character on a certain level. The degree to which it is traumatizing is dependent on the type of story it is. Obviously, a romantic comedy is not as traumatizing as going into war. Yeah. But there is a trauma in having your heart broken. Right, there's a trauma in losing someone in your life. Right. But it's learning how we adjust to these traumas, not by pretending they didn't exist, not by pretending we can erase them from our memories, not by saying we're fine, but rather accepting that, yeah, this is who I am now. I have suffered this, I will continue to suffer this, but I have found a way to make it work. But yes, all storytelling involves PTS. The third act is dealing with your post-traumatic stress.
And that's the key act, because you could easily not deal with it.
Right, and I would argue that the bulk of American storytelling, and worse, Hollywood filmmaking, is not 3-act storytelling, it's 1.5-act storytelling.
It's the love affair, and it's the breakup, and then it's the reconciliation.
Right, it's just 1.5 acts. You were living in a delusion. You thought things were good, but then they were bad. Right. But just buy this pharmaceutical, buy this car, vote for this politician, and then everything will be great again. Right? And so 1.5 act stories, once again, constituting most of Hollywood filmmaking, plays off this thing like, oh, you thought it was bad, but don't worry, we'll fix it for you. But it ignores that any fix comes with a sacrifice.
So, in your worldview, Act 3 always involves a sacrifice.
Whether you like it or not, it's already there. Yes, certainly. And once again, this is developing as we're talking, but I would say there's something about architecture which I wish would acknowledge that.
No, architecture is focused on solution making. We do not acknowledge the persistence of problem.
Right,
we
but
are solution makers.
But 1.5 act storytelling exists. Politicians give campaign speeches.
Most of
commercials.
architecture is 1.5 acts.
Right, and it is failing to acknowledge the thing that it does. So, and pardon me if I'm misinterpreting this, but your father got to work on Chandigarh and had some ideas of what it should do, and he wanted to celebrate nature and the animal world around him, and did some beautiful, amazing, memorable things, and at the same time created something that was anti-rural and anti-animal, which was in direct conflict with the goal was.
Right.
And so, in my mind, any architecture may solve one problem, but it's probably creating another in the process.
Well, there's definitely an autobiographical element to your story, it seems to me.
You are correct that I am informed by and potentially biased by my experience of the world.
Give me a key moment that stays with you.
Like a key traumatic moment that stays with me?
Yes.
I'll give you a little background which will lead to one of those moments. So, from the time I was very young till the time I was about 14 or 15, I was physically and sexually abused by members of my family on a fairly regular basis. And the most damaging part in my mind about it all was not the suffering in the moment. That was not good. But rather the choices I made to remain silent about it, not speak to anyone, either within the family, outside. And the fact that it had a crazy-making component to it. There was a reality I was experiencing that everyone else denied. In fact, one of the reasons that the current times that we live in are so anxiety-inducing for me politically is that I'm experiencing that same sort of thing of like, I think I know the reality I live in, but there seems to be a large force conveying an alternate reality.
Right.
So that's tremendously disturbing. There are a lot of things that are tied to that, but one of them is this. I went to a very hoity-toity private school in Manhattan, and every year they had a public speaking competition, and I always, from 4th grade on, I participated, and I'd give some trite, silly speech, and I'd do well. And but the school was run by a number of people who might be considered neo-Nazis in different settings.
I know the type.
A fairly abusive, uncaring lot.
No, I went to the exact same school you did.
Oh, good. So,
Only it was in India.
Maybe they're franchising. We don't know. And so there was one instructor in particular who was just ridiculously harsh, both physically and emotionally. Just a terrible
he came
human being.
to India.
So finally, in 7th grade, the speaking contest came up, and before you could speak before the whole school, you had to qualify in your class. And so I wrote a speech about him and how unjust I thought he was. I changed his name ever so slightly, but it was obvious who it was.
Wow, you got guts, man.
Well, I had something. I don't maybe guts and no brains. So I delivered the speech to my class, and I was chosen to represent the class.
You were.
And the talk was a day or two later, but by the end of that school day, some of my fellow students who were sort of his toadies had reported this to him, and he cornered me in the gymnasium, and it's so out of a bad movie. He and two of my fellow students who were jocks, the teacher and the two guys were holding lacrosse sticks and twirling them like an old villain's mustache or something. And he walked up to me and he's like poking me in the chest. And he says, "You will not give that talk. You will not give that speech. If you give that talk, your life will be more miserable than you can possibly imagine." And I'm thinking, more miserable than my life already is? Like, wow, it's quite a threat. And I'm freaking out, and I go home, and I don't know who to talk to, because I don't talk to my family, and I'm not sure they would believe me, and I'm like, I'm just...
No, there's no option. Yeah.
And so I go home, and I'm fighting in my head, what am I going to do? And that night, I write a second speech. I don't know, something totally innocuous. And the morning of the speech comes up, and I go, and we wore our little school blazers because we had our our dress uniforms. I had my speech, one speech on index cards in one pocket, and the other speech on another set of cards in the other pocket. And until I walked to the podium, I didn't know which talk I would give. And I get up to the podium, and I, once again, guts, no brains, I decide I'm going to give the talk that I initially gave.
Yeah.
And in this auditorium, which was wide but fairly shallow, he stands directly across from me, and I try to look at everybody else in the audience, but like one of those oil paintings, his eyes just follow me everywhere. Like, oh my God! And I'm terrified. I don't know that ever before since I have felt as scared as I did in that moment. And I get through the speech relatively well. And the second I pick up the cards and I turn the stage, I can remember, like, I just start bawling. Like, I'm crying, and like, snot is coming out of my nose. And one of the great bonus treats was, once you were done with your speech, you still had to sit in a chair facing the entire audience with the other speakers. So I'm just like, total mess. And true to his word, the instructor did make my life more miserable than it ever had been. Like, the rest of the school year was so bad, I was looking forward to the summer with my family. That's how awful it was.
With a sexually abusive.
Right. And so, miserable rest of the school year, miserable summer, and then I returned to school the following fall, and an English teacher who always liked me said, "You know, I am not allowed to say anything to you about this, but it's an amazing thing you did." And he said, "What you should consider today is who is here right now. Look around you." And the fact of the matter was, I was there, and that teacher was gone. He allegedly took a job at another school, but the implication was that he left because that became too uncomfortable. And so in that moment, I found my voice to a certain extent, and I also felt I found, even though I wasn't thinking this at the time, I found a purpose for story. And story was there to wake and alert others to the dangers around us, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense.
So I guess I am biased by that sort of experience. I've had many experiences like that where story serves more than the purpose to entertain.
Right,
I mean, I think entertainment is great.
Yeah.
And obviously, like, a little bit of humor and everything. If you're not accomplishing something more than that, I question the need for its existence.
I mean, I'm thinking of my equivalent schoolmaster.
Yes.
Who was recently escaped from torture school,
Right.
who practiced his skills on the boys in uniform. And what I remember is that I was, the class prefect, and that on one occasion, for completely illegitimate reasons, he literally beat the shit out of me and a group of 3 or 4 of us who were together.
So it wasn't singling you out. It was
it was us.
Okay.
This particular group.
Right.
But the trauma is that I did nothing about it.
That's a tough one to live with.
Certainly, there was no opportunity to talk about it at home.
Were you worried that they wouldn't believe you? Were they worried that they wouldn't care? Or
it was sort of an idle conceit that I'm not going to let this get to me.
it's fair. I can relate that there was a certain stoicism to it after a while. But I believe that does something to you. I mean, and I guess that's similar to, convets with PTS, that you can keep those stories inside, but it's going to do a lot of damage in the process. When I said earlier that I believe in my approach is write what you are desperate to understand, part of it is the exorcising of those stories that we haven't told and can't comprehend. Whether it's we can't comprehend the action of those who have victimized us, or whether it's simply you can't comprehend why we were silent or passive in response to it. But I think those are really significant tales to tell. An interesting thing is that, as I said, like there's a crazy making element of this when one's reality is not matched by anybody else's tale. Like if you're not telling your family and you can't speak to the headmaster, you are stuck with a reality which goes unacknowledged. Story allows that to be acknowledged in some way. But just a few years ago, I had lunch with someone I went to high school with. I hadn't seen her for years, and she is now a therapist. But at some point, for some reason, I've told her that story, which I rarely tell anyone. So I gave her an overview of it, and she said, "Oh, I always thought there was something wrong with those members of your family. I just didn't know for sure." And I'm just going to get the impression that I cry all the time, but again, I just started crying in the middle of this Panera or whatever, because it was the very first time after decades that anyone had acknowledged the reality of that world, and it was one of the most liberating moments I've experienced. And so in that case, story not only allowed me to get something out and express not only where I had been, but where I've come to, but I was able to find a certain amount of validation in that process. The best storytelling allows us to find in humanity in others and in ourselves. Not the perfection, but the wounds, the failings, the flaws. But maybe if I came from a perfectly charmed childhood, I wouldn't feel this way at all. Like, give me some more Superman movies. It's great.
And that's what makes stories universal, you say.
Story with a capital S, yes. That's what it is. I think that you find something that you relate to, no matter what genre it is, no matter what the circumstances of the plot may be, you find someone that reverberates with you on some deep level. And I'm not drawn to perfection, and I mention Superman always because I know there have been changes in the recent past with that character, but essentially Superman sort of embodies what I think is wrong with a lot of Western storytelling, is that the characters, the protagonists, start off as perfect. I mean, if you come to this planet and you have the gift of flight and super speed, you're invincible and you can turn back time by flying around Earth. But that character's not particularly intriguing because he doesn't risk anything in the process. There's no sacrifice, there are no challenges.
Risk is more interesting than sacrifice.
Yeah, sacrifice is a byproduct of risk, but the risk has to be there.
I mean, there's sort of a Catholic, I suppose, Jewish sense attaching innate value to sacrifice, which sometimes I question.
I'm not a fan of that either. I don't want it to be about the heroic thing that they sacrifice something. It's just that one does, whether you choose to or not.
Right. Well, there is something strange about that idea of sacrifice, I suppose, of the nailed Jesus on the cross, I guess. I mean, I'm not religious at all. I don't even belong to the Abrahamic traditions.
There is a book turned into a movie, Last Temptation of Christ.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it, yeah.
And the book, the Katsantzakis book.
Yeah.
And as a non-practicing Jew, don't have a lot of interest in the sequel anyway. But I love that book and I love that movie on a certain level. Because, and this to some is sacrilegious, but it humanized Christ in such a way that I finally got the story. Like, if that's what you were telling in church all the time, not because I believe, but I'd go for that story. That's an interesting story. That book and that movie's ability to come up with real story made Christ and the idea of the New Testament more appealing. And then I reread the New Testament, and then I was like, okay, we'll go back to the Katsantzakis.
So what I'm trying to get to is the chapter 3 of that story, the third act. How does that become a narrative for tomorrow or today? I know you teach storytelling in this way.
Right.
But I'm interested more in how does that become a lifeline for everyday living?
There are two parts. From a purely logistical standpoint, what I'd say in approaching storytelling, I have an unorthodox approach to my own storytelling and what I would advise for students, which is that you not know the third act until you get to it. Essentially, I want to write myself into a hole by the end of the second act, to the place where, like, oh, I have no idea what I'm going to do now.
Yeah.
And write that once I get to it, and then organically find it, whatever it may be, because that's where I'm going to learn something.
Yeah.
So there's that part of it, which is a craft thing. From a personal value standpoint, what I'd say is this, that in our lives, we don't have the time, energy, sometimes the courage, whatever it takes to explore all the options we have to make our lives better.
Yeah.
But I do have time to write and tell stories. And so I'll often tell people I work with that storytelling saved my life, and I mean it. That if it weren't for story, I wouldn't be here. I would be dead or in prison or in an asylum or drinking or drugging myself to death. And storytelling saved my life in this way, that while I didn't have the time, energy, courage necessarily to make some of the changes in my life that I probably could have, should have, part of that just came from fear, from ignorance. But every character I wrote, because I was approaching a story about, like, write something you're desperate to understand, every story I wrote had a character who I looked at as being on sort of a reconnaissance mission for me. And if I sent that character 10 paces ahead of me in real life, and they survive, I might have the nerve to take 2 steps forward. And if he or she went 10 steps forward and blew up, I'd go like, all right, I like it here. That's fine. But I was able, and continue to be able, to test a lot of life choices through story rather than moving forward irrationally. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've certainly, as I'm sure others, have been capable of making rash decisions, unwise decisions, but story allows me to make fewer of them. But seriously, in the third act, what I like to see is that the character has made some choices, and then I look at that and I sort of sit with, well, is she, he, it better off for that decision? Are they better off having gone through the delusional stage of the first act, the highs and lows of the fantasy of the second act, and now faced with that new reality? Are they better off than they were before? I hope so. But I can at least consider it. Going back to the Schlossberg, it creates that context in which I can think and maybe find something of meaning and use. And ideally, somebody else will get it. Even in the smallest thing in our conversation here, the idea that a continent away, your schooling experience was not that different from mine. That's one of the beauties of story. Like, yes. Oh, there's a connectivity. Oh my God, that's not an isolated incident.
Right.
Right.
We were probably getting beat up in the same year.
Right. Exactly. Ruler to the head this afternoon. Don't know why, but it happened. But I'm still a straight A student. That seems to be the only thing that counts. That was really what my parents were concerned about. How the grades? Good? Okay, good.
Yeah, this is why stand-up is such a fantastic life force. Because it enables people to tell stories which are actually really horrifying.
Yeah.
But everybody can have a good laugh about it.
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, it's I think definitely a part of the cultural Judaism is the idea, like, you take trauma and you make light of it, because why not? My colleague Brian McDonald, I always like it, he describes the difference between black humor and Jewish humor. He said for him, black humor is life, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And he said Jewish humor is when life gives you lemons, you say, lemons again? Hey. So that really is the thing, a certain acceptance of suffering and a willingness to joke about it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That's what it's all about. Nice to have you on Architecture Talk, Warren.
Thank you. It was an honor. Everybody should rent 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. Beautiful Blu-ray edition out there. 50th anniversary. Order now and get those 7 truths for free.
Thank you very much for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash. I am the host of the show, and our show's producer is Elizabeth Umbenhauer. If you like the show, please do remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And also take a moment and rate us on iTunes. Thank you very much, and see you next time.